Good morning. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Morton Blackwell, president of the Leadership Institute, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this, our Wednesday Wake Up Club breakfast. As many of you know, we had originally scheduled to have John Bolton of the State Department here, but his job called him out of the country. Unfortunately, we had enough notice that we could find someone who could fill in and will do a great job for us this morning. We live in interesting times. This morning's Washington Times quotes Senator Patrick Leahy, chairman of the Judiciary Committee, regarding nominations. We are moving forward as quickly as we can, and I will continue to do that. No matter what is said on the other side, no matter how much things are taken out of context, no matter how much fiction we hear on the floor from that side, I will move them forward. The numbers are, out of 29 appointments to the U.S. Court of Appeals circuit judgeships that President Bush has made, 7 have been confirmed. The year is not yet over, but President Clinton's nominated 22 circuit judges with 19 confirmed in the first 2 years. President George Herbert Walker Bush nominated 23 circuit judges with 22 confirmed. President Ronald Reagan nominated 20 circuit judges with 19 confirmed. We really do live in interesting times. This year, the Leadership Institute has thus far trained 649 students in 26 individual schools. We have placed 15 job seekers through our employment placement service. We did a tally, I guess, in the past month and found that we now have 85 graduates of our broadcast journalism school who are currently working full-time in television news, a real network we are building of our own. It's a broadcasting network, but it's not quite like ABC, CBS, NBC, CNN. You have before you on the table there our 2002 school schedule. I ask that you take a moment to review the calendar and consider attending one of our programs or recommending our programs to your conservative friends. And now to lead us in an invocation and pledge of allegiance, Ty Bales. Ty recently came to the Leadership Institute by way of Charlottesville, Virginia. In 1994, he attended the Youth Leadership School as a very young man and used the skills he learned to become student government president at Hampton-Sydney College in Central Virginia. Since then, Ty worked on 2 congressional campaigns and has volunteered for Oliver North's Senate campaign and George Allen's gubernatorial campaign in Virginia. Today, Ty works in our grassroots activists department, helping recruit and train conservative candidates and activists to be more effective. Ty?
Good morning. Good morning. Thank you for being here with us this morning. If you would please bow your heads and join me in a few words of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for bringing us all here together this morning at the Leadership Institute. Heavenly Father, I want to thank you for all the many blessings you've bestowed upon us today. Thank you for blessing us with the United States of America and for giving us liberty and freedom. Thank you for blessing us with our country's leaders, both past and present, some of which are sitting here with us this morning. Dear Father, we lift our leaders up to you, especially our President, George W. Bush, and we pray that our leaders will always have their eyes and hearts set on you. Dear Father, thank you for the Leadership Institute and the awesome opportunity you've given us here to positively affect those in the public policy arena and to positively affect conservatives in the political world. Father, we thank you for our speaker this morning and the words he has to share with us. And we thank you for blessing us with this breakfast this morning. Heavenly Father, we pray these things in your holy name. Amen. If you would please join me in saying the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
We're going to have to get this eagle straight. Veteran participants in this breakfast will remember that the staff fell over and we had an eagle for a time that had no left wing on it, which was all right with me. And now we've replaced it with a new eagle, but this time the eagle's back is turned to it. So just a staff word to the wise. There we go. Let's do it this way. Now I want to introduce Christian Roby. He will provide us with a commercial from the Nonprofit Leadership Institute. He'll update us on the schools division of the programs department. Christian is schools coordinator here at the Institute, where he's responsible for recruiting students for most of the Leadership Institute's educational programs. Prior to being employed at the Institute, Christian worked for a variety of conservative and free market think tanks, including Cato, Americans for Tax Reform, the Foundation for Economic Education, and Citizens for a Sound Economy. Christian graduated from Virginia Tech with a degree in philosophy.
Right. I see a couple of familiar faces from the Campaign Leadership School. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning. Good morning. We recently had in the month of February, the month of March, the Campaign Leadership School, where we trained 47 people how to succeed and win in elections. Several of those people were candidates that were running for office, that are currently running for office, including some in the local area, Maryland especially, God bless them. We also have coming up our public speaking workshop, which I will be attending, and we will have the Internet Leadership Workshop. The public speaking workshop is this Friday, April 5th, and the Internet Leadership Workshop is coming up on Saturday, the day after, the day after that. There's one other thing. I usually do go down a rundown of the schools that we hold, and report on the schools and the numbers that we hold, and things of that nature. But just to mix it up a little bit, I'll share a brief anecdote that Morton will get a kick out of. I worked here about 2 or so years ago. I guess it's been that long. And then I came on board 7 or so months ago. And I always believed in the mission of the Institute and what we were doing. But I never quite got it until about 3 or 4 months ago. And then it was clicked. It was one of those aha moments. And it's kind of worth sharing. If they take you on a tour downstairs, there is... who does the tour? Is there a person here who does the tour? Maybe not. Yeah, do they go down the basement? There's a big old bicycle poster, well, not a bicycle, but a poster of a bicycle. And it's really modern looking, but the shocking thing is that it's 500 years old, or close to 500 years old. It was designed by Leonardo da Vinci. And the reason why Morton puts it up there, and I've actually spent time in his office with him explaining this to me, is because he had this great idea of a bicycle. He had the idea of a bicycle, but the actual bicycle was not invented until, does anyone know? This was kind of an interesting fact. The end of the 19th century. And when I heard that, and also with conversations with Morton, it clicked that just ideas in themselves, and being a major in philosophy, I love ideas. Ideas in themselves are not important enough. You have to be trained, and you have to actualize those ideas. And it all came together for me when I attended the Campaign Leadership School, and I sat through the first lecture, The Real Nature of Politics, and that's what we do. So if any of you all, and it was, even after being involved in the conservative movement for so long, it struck me how important our work is here that we do. So if any of you all are donors, or if you're activists, or if you're considering sending somebody to the schools, that is one of the most important things that I think our schools do. And I've been working here, so that is my personal anecdote. So thank you for coming to Leadership Institute.
Thanks a lot, Christian. Those of you who are interested and have not been on a thorough tour at the conclusion of the event this morning, the opportunity will be available to you, and our guide will take you and show you this big blow-up of Leonardo's design of a bicycle. One interesting aspect of it that I will add was that Leonardo designed this bicycle, with handlebars and pedals and chains, and I mean, very much like the modern bicycle. And it was in his notebook. And when he died, the notebooks wound up in the hands of Spain. And somebody in Spain took those notebooks and pasted them on larger, more sturdy pieces of paper. And there they stayed in the Biblioteca Nacional in Madrid for hundreds of years. And after the bicycle was developed, somebody carefully removed the notebooks from those pages that they'd been pasted on, and found Leonardo's design of a bicycle on the back where it had been covered. And so nobody had been able even to see his idea, which was a great idea but had no consequences as a result of his idea. To introduce our speaker is Chris Steele. Chris is the programs administrator here at the Institute, and he oversees all aspects of school setup and faculty recruitment for many of our schools. He's also the founder and editor of our only public publication, and that is the College Briefing, which is a weekly email digest, i.e. very inexpensive to send out, that exposes leftists in college newspapers in their own words, and it's very interesting. And maybe before he actually introduces our speaker, he'll just give you the address on the web where you can get it. No more commercials, but just an address on the web. In '98, Chris worked in the office of Representative Dick Armey of Texas, where his emphasis was on the flat tax. Chris founded the Rutherford Junior Council, an organization to getting the youth of his town involved in local politics, and he's a graduate of Rutgers with degrees in political science and history. Chris.
Thank you all. Thank you, Morton. As he said, I'll keep this commercial brief. The address, if you wish to subscribe to the College Briefing, is easy enough. It's www.collegebriefing.org or .com or .net, but .org is the one to go to. Don't the commercial. Now I will introduce our speaker of the day. It was written of our speaker, Bruce Bartlett, in the wonderful book, 7 Fat Years, that he, Robert Mundell, Arthur Laffer, Paul Craig Roberts, Jude Wanniski, and others all played important roles in spreading the essential idea that tax rates matter and that they do and can affect economic growth. In 1977, he joined the staff of Representative Jack Kemp and helped draft the famous Kemp-Roth tax bill. He worked then for Senator Roger Epson of Iowa as a chief legislative assistant. In 1981, Mr. Bartlett joined the staff of the Joint Economic Committee of Congress as deputy director and eventually became executive director in 1983. After a brief stint with the Heritage Foundation, he served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Economic Policy at the U.S. Treasury Department, serving from 1988 to 1993. He's a prolific author, having published over 900 articles in national publications, including such titles as It's Easy to Defend Tax Cuts, Protectionism, The Backwards Approach, and The Campaign Against Big Food. He's also published 4 books, including Reaganomics, Supply Side Economics, and Action in 1981. Please join me in welcoming Bruce Bartlett.
I'm also a graduate of Rutgers, by the way. It doesn't mention that. I wasn't really given a topic to talk about except in a general way about taxation, and obviously this is a time of year when everybody thinks about that sort of thing. I myself did my taxes a few weeks ago, or rather my accountant did my taxes a few weeks ago after I'd spent many, many hours organizing the material. I'll get a refund this year, but I won't really know what my net is because I haven't gotten my accountant's bill yet. But that really makes an important point about taxation, which is that we think about the taxes we pay, perhaps not as much as we should, but we almost never think about the costs of the tax system that are over and above the tax system. That is, the amount of money we spend on accountants, which is billions of dollars a year, the amount of time that we spend organizing our affairs, the amount, that includes time spent thinking about whether I should invest in municipal bonds that are tax-free or taxable bonds, whether I should invest for capital gains, which are taxed at a lower rate, or invest for dividends. Those are all costs of the tax system that may be very heavy. Some people are very easily confused about these things, very easily misled. I remember talking to a friend of mine once who took all the money in his IRA and had invested it in municipal bonds. And I said, he didn't know that municipal bonds are not taxable, so therefore you get an interest rate that is lower by approximately the amount of the tax rate. And in fact, you can easily figure out what the average marginal tax rate is for the economy as a whole simply by comparing taxable and non-taxable yields on equivalent securities. So here he was, in essence, paying a tax in a tax-exempt account by getting a lower yield. And that's a cost too. I mean, I don't know how much money he lost by doing this, but it was a cost of the tax system that is not added to the overall burden of taxation. And of course, businesses bear a huge burden as well. That we often don't see when we buy a share of stock. We hope that stock will go up or we'll get some dividends, but the corporation is taxed already on all of those profits. And then if you get some capital gains or you get some dividends, you're going to pay taxes on the exact same profits that were already taxed once. So capital in this country is very, very heavily taxed, and the consequence of this is that there's less investment, fewer jobs, wages are lower, productivity is lower. Again, all of that is a cost of the tax system that we never ever hear anything about. And it's really rather amazing how little of this is known. I mean, I just explained it in a few minutes, but it's probably the vast majority of Americans have never thought about the tax system any more deeply than that. My goal all along, since I've been working in tax policy for well over 25 years, has been to try to simplify the tax system, to lower the tax rate, to exempt entrepreneurial income, capital income to the greatest extent possible, because that's what creates growth, and that's what we all want. In the tax system, there aren't that many things really that economists know that we can do in terms of public policy that will increase growth, but we do know that if you cut taxes on capital, that will increase growth. So why don't we do this very simple thing? Well, there's a very simple reason, which is that most of the capital is owned by the rich. Poor people don't own capital. They should try to get it, but they're living from hand to mouth. They have no saving. They have no money to invest in the stock market. So the people that we depend upon to supply the capital, to build the machinery, to build the plants, to create the businesses, necessarily has to come from the well-to-do. And so anything you would do to increase growth, which would primarily help the working class, they're the ones who are going to get the jobs, they're the ones who are going to get the higher wages, is deemed to be a giveaway to the rich. So we punish the rich, and we end up actually hurting the poor. it's a very, very perverse system. But every single time I have ever discussed the idea of taxing only consumption, let us say, and exempting saving, or having a flat rate income tax, the first thing you hear is, this is a giveaway to the rich. My friends at the Citizens for Tax Justice, are very adept at putting out distribution tables, they're called. You've probably seen these in the paper, which anytime you propose a tax bill, it shows these income categories, 10 to 20, 20 to 30,000 a year, blah, blah, blah. And if you were to propose, say, a cut in the capital gains tax, you're going to see no benefits for 99% or so of the population, and all the benefits go to the rich. And so people say, well, that's unfair. It doesn't matter what the economic consequences are. It doesn't matter that we would get more saving, more investment, more businesses, more growth, more jobs. That's just all ignored. They just look at the superficial table, and the other side knows this, and they produce these tables instantaneously, and they post them on the web the minute a tax bill is introduced. And it's a very sad commentary that nobody on our side has ever come up with a way of doing what they do. Part of it is just because it's too hard to explain. The consequences of a reduction in tax rates is difficult to quantify. It's very difficult to produce the same kind of table showing that people in the lower income brackets will get a significant increase in income over a certain period of time if you adopt this policy. People tend to be focused on the very short term. But every once in a while we're able to overcome the resistance. Quite frankly, I was astonished to see that the Congress voted to abolish the estate tax. I mean, the estate tax is purely a tax that applies only to the wealthy, because you had to have well over, I think it was $700,000 in assets before you paid a penny of estate taxes. But a very good campaign was launched, and I was involved in that, to try to explain to people some of the things that I'm trying to explain now about how family farms can't be passed on, family businesses can't be passed on, how small business people have to spend a lot of money out of their profits to buy insurance policies so that their heirs will have the cash to pay the estate tax when it's due. And things of this sort, to really explain to people what the economic consequences of this tax are. And lo and behold, it worked. But it took a long time, and it took us a long time to do some of the things that I was involved with the Kemp-Roth bill, for example, which, incidentally, this is the 25th anniversary this year of the introduction of that legislation in 1977. Which, as some of you, or maybe most of you know, formed the basis for the Reagan Tax Cut in 1981. It was the #1 issue that Ronald Reagan ran on in 1980, of cutting tax rates across the board. And one of the reasons we were successful in doing this is we constantly talked about how it was John F. Kennedy who first did an across-the-board tax rate reduction. And we used to constantly talk about emulating Kennedy. And over the years, I've thought about this some more, and it just is really remarkable. I mean, here you had this very liberal Democrat from Massachusetts who had never said or done anything in his congressional career that I could discover that had anything to do with taxes or showed any deep understanding of the economy during his years in the House and the Senate. And all of a sudden, he becomes president. And he's surrounded by all these very, very liberal advisors. One of his his teacher at Harvard had been John Kenneth Galbraith, possibly the most liberal of all well-known American economists. And he was a close advisor of Kennedy's, and all of his advisors were very into what is called Keynesian economics, which says deficits are good, and that's what drives the economy. And they all said, well, the economy is slow and we need to deliberately increase the budget deficit to get growth going. And Kennedy said, well, we can do that two ways, right? We can either increase government spending, that will increase the deficit, or we can reduce taxation. That will also increase the deficit by the same amount. Isn't that right? And they said, yeah, that's right. But if they were all in favor of increasing spending, they wanted to build more roads and bridges and things like that. And Kennedy said, no, I want to cut taxes. That's the way we're going to implement Keynesian economics and increase the deficit. And he was quite blunt about that. But then his advisor said, okay, Mr. President, that's fine. There's lots of different ways we can cut taxes. We can have a one-shot tax rebate, and we'll just mail out checks to people, including those who didn't pay any taxes, as we did last year. Or we can increase the personal exemption, or we can have some kind of tax credit for the poor or something like that. And of course, none of them suggested even remotely that there was anything that ought to be done for the wealthy, because they don't need tax cuts. They're rich. What do they need more money for? And he said, no, we're going to cut tax rates across the board. We're going to lower the top tax rate, which was 91% in 1962 or 1963, the same rate it had been since the Korean War. We had never cut the rates that were increased to pay for the war after the war. We just kept them up there. That's what always happens. You know, this ratchet effect with taxation. And so Kennedy said, no, we're going to cut tax rates for everybody. And he wanted to cut the top rate to 50%, but he couldn't get that, so he settled for cutting it to just 70%, which in and of itself was still a remarkable accomplishment, considering that many of our competitors in the world, for example, the British, kept their World War II tax rates all the way up until Margaret Thatcher was elected. And that's one of the reasons why that country went into decline. So it was very important, and it was purely, my point is, it was purely Kennedy's leadership. It wasn't somebody on his staff, you know, whispering in his ear saying, do it this way. That's the supply side way. That's the way we'll get incentives. There was nothing in his background or training that would have, he never studied with any free market economists, to my knowledge. I don't know where he got it from, and I wish I could find out. I've been told that one of his principal influences was Ludwig Erhard, who some of you may remember was the Chancellor of Germany at that time. But more importantly, he had been the economic minister of West Germany after the war, and was really the architect of the German recovery after World War II. And I've been told, and I can't document this, that Kennedy met with Erhard at some point early in his presidency and asked him, you know, what he ought to do to get the economy going in the United States, because Erhard was widely viewed as a wizard, a great economist. And he said, cut tax rates. And so maybe that's where it came from. I don't know, but perhaps it's serendipity, or maybe Kennedy was really a much smarter fellow than people think he was. And people already think he was a pretty smart fellow. But it just shows, you know, a little bit about something about the power of ideas and where these things come from. And sometimes they percolate around for a long time. I mean, I know when I first started working on what came to be called supply-side economics, we looked back to the history of American taxation. We looked at things that Andrew Mellon, who was Secretary of the Treasury during the 1920s, had said, and Calvin Coolidge. And I remember that when Ronald Reagan became president, in the cabinet room, there's always, on either side of the door leading into the Oval Office, there's always two portraits of the president's favorite predecessors. And I don't remember who Carter had up there, some Democrats. And one of the people Reagan put up there was Calvin Coolidge. And I thought that was quite interesting, because he understood, he knew the history. I don't know where he got it from, but he knew it, and tried to emulate that. And we always thought that what we were doing was just rediscovering the great truths of economics that had been known since the time of Adam Smith, but had simply been forgotten. And that's one of the real tragedies of the whole business that we're all in here, is that there are no permanent victories. You can't teach people something and then feel you don't have to teach it to them again. People's memories are short. The collective memory is very short. You have people who knew things, and they're no longer with us, and we have young people coming into the system who are just blank slates and they know nothing. And so you have to constantly reteach the generations over and over again the same truths that you may have already learned a long time ago and relearned several times since. And it gets to be a little bit boring after a while, quite frankly. It's a problem for me. I write two nationally syndicated newspaper columns every week, and I have to try to constantly think of ways to freshen up and find new ways to write about these issues in a way that is timely and interesting, so that I can teach the same lesson all over again, year in and year out. And it's always very frustrating to me to go back to Capitol Hill and talk to members of Congress who are, you know, very bright and hardworking and determined, and they really want to do the right thing. And then you talk to them and say, "Oh, we need to cut taxes." That's exactly right. So what we need is a tax rebate. And, you know, I mean, even President Bush was taken in by this silly notion. It's a utterly stupid way of cutting taxes. It's not really cutting taxes at all. It's the same thing as government spending. I mean, it's not you're not affecting incentives. And you hear these members, they talk about, oh, we need to put dollars in people's pockets. And that's not what we need to do at all. What we need to do is increase the rate of return on productive economic activity. And by reducing the marginal tax rate, that's how you do that. And they don't understand the difference between an average tax rate, which is your total taxes divided by your total income, and the marginal tax rate, which is the tax you paid on the last dollar you earned. And I doubt that there's any person in this room who even knows what their marginal tax bracket is. The top rate in the United States right now is 39.6%, and there's probably a few people in this room who paid some taxes at that tax rate, even though the total amount of taxes they ended up paying as a share of their total income might have been half that. And but if you're going to decide, am I going to buy a municipal bond or a taxable bond? Am I going to do these other investment things that I talked about earlier? That's the rate that matters. You know, that's the one that you should be using to decide what is the tipping point. If the difference between, say, a municipal bond and a taxable bond is 25%, and you're in the 39% bracket, well, then buying that municipal bond is a good deal. If you were only in the 15% bracket, then it would be a very bad deal. So these are very important decisions that have a great deal of impact on our financial well-being, and deciding whether to use a Roth IRA or a tax or a traditional IRA. All these kinds of things that affect us in our personal lives are very much related to taxation, and we ought to be much more aware of these things than we are. And I would certainly urge all of you, any of you who have accountants, to spend a little time talking with them about things you ought to be doing with your own personal finances to minimize your tax burden. I'm sure everybody always thinks that they do, but one reason I pay an accountant is because he always thinks of some stuff that I didn't think of, or maybe he will give me the courage to take a chance on a deduction that I might have had a little bit of doubt about. But you know, I've been audited by the IRS. When I went to work at the Treasury Department, they neglected to tell me before I started working that every senior Treasury official is audited routinely. So that was it turned out not to be too bad for me. They audited me for 3 full years, and I ended up with a $29 refund. But some friends of mine who I was working with, especially some of the female staff whose husbands had been filing their tax returns and they hadn't been doing anything except signing them, you know, they found out their husbands weren't necessarily doing everything they should have been doing in the tax area, and they had to pay a lot of penalties and taxes. So again, I think it's something that we all want to pay more attention to and not just make a lot of assumptions about what is being done. I think I'll just finish up and take some questions about some of the things that are going on right now. The deterioration of the budget surplus has pretty much put tax policy on hold for now, and there really are no significant efforts underway that I know of to get a major tax cut through this year. The Congress is mainly concerned about getting out early and getting back to run for re-election. And the president's is totally focused on the war and is really not thinking about anything else. The Treasury is doing some research on the idea of tax simplification that may evolve into a tax reform proposal of some kind, but we're in the very early stages of that. The thinking among some of the experts and the thinkers on taxation has moved a bit away, I think, from the idea of total reform of the system, that is just wiping the slate clean and starting all over again with something like a flat tax. I think people have just decided that that's just too big to bite off in one gulp, and that we need to think about incremental reforms that move us in the direction of some kind of a more sensible tax system, and there are a lot of things that could be done to do that that are potentially that are politically doable. And one of them is one thing that almost everybody seems to agree upon is that we need to allow businesses to write off their investments in plant and equipment more quickly, especially since so much of investment in business these days is in high-tech equipment and things of that sort that don't really wear out in the traditional sense of depreciation, which is that you have a lathe or something like that and you use it for a few years, and after a while it just doesn't work anymore. No matter how carefully you take care of it or repair it, it just doesn't work anymore, and you've got to buy a new one. And so you give businesses depreciation to account for that wearing out. But computer software never wears out. I mean, there's nothing to wear out. It just becomes obsolete, and it becomes obsolete very quickly. And so you've got a problem here that businesses cannot depreciate a lot of their investments as fast as they are becoming obsolete. And this is inhibiting investment. And I think there's also a view that we need to give people more ability to save in tax-exempt accounts like IRAs, 401ks, but not limit it exclusively to retirement saving, although that's important as well. And I think that this has a twofold, a beneficial effect in two ways. One is obviously it provides more saving for the economy that can be used to create investment and jobs. But the other is, I think that we need to give people more resources of their own in retirement because, no matter how much the other side tries to fight Social Security reform, they can't fight the numbers. And the numbers are that the system is unstable and is simply not going to last unless fundamental changes are made. And a lot of people, including myself, had hoped that we would be able to move in the direction of private accounts, but I think that the ground is not yet well plowed for that sort of thing. That's just too big a reform to try to do without the president being totally focused on it, and he's not. He's got other things on his mind. And so the whole idea of doing something on Social Security, I think, is pretty much down the tubes for the time being. But if we can do something through the income tax to create more opportunities for people to save for retirement, then perhaps when the day comes that we inevitably have to do something to fix the Social Security system, the transition won't be so difficult. It'll be a lot. The population of people who are mainly concerned about this issue might not be so concerned about having a cost of living adjustment that is less than inflation or something along those lines. Or some other type of reform that would trim benefits, higher retirement age, something of that sort. I mean, if they had a couple of $100,000 sitting in an account at retirement, they would and weren't totally dependent upon Social Security, which is unfortunately the case with many people. Then maybe you can do some sensible things that we should have been doing all along, but unfortunately didn't. We got off on the wrong track in the 1930s. And there really has been no going back ever since. My column this morning in the Washington Times is about a new effort to emulate the great success of the attack on big tobacco by going after foods now. You may have noticed, I have, just in the last few weeks there have been a raft of stories in the major media about how the epidemic of obesity. And I've read stories that by respected physicians saying obesity is worse than cigarette smoking. And I didn't think there was anything worse than cigarette smoking, at least according to Bill Clinton and his pals. And I really believe that they're trying to set the stage to do the same damn thing. They're going to try to put extra taxes on sugar and sugary foods or high fat content foods, put special taxes on fast foods, which are universally called junk food by the people who write about this sort of thing. And basically you're going to be forced to be healthy whether you like it or not, and the liberal media are going to beat this into the ground. There are a number of efforts underway in the states, especially California, as you might imagine, to put special taxes on these kinds of foods. And of course the money will all be used for nutritional information. None of it will go into the general fund of the government, but of course we know that's a lie. And I just see all the pieces coming together. And the only thing we're missing are the trial lawyers who haven't yet figured out how to bring a class action suit against McDonald's. But considering that we now have somebody being given serious consideration for bringing reparations for slavery against some companies that were in business before the Civil War, and this is not the issue here is not whether this will be successful. I don't think it will be, but it's not being laughed out of the door. People are taking it seriously. They're talking about this as if it's a worthwhile thing to do, and if you can do that, then there's really no limit to what you can do. The problem with the trial lawyers, I think, is a problem that our side has not given nearly enough attention to. We've got to do something about it because we're just circumventing democracy. As bad as the U.S. Senate is under Tom Daschle, I'd rather have them than a bunch of judges and lawyers make public policy. At least you can put some pressure on those guys, but you can't put any pressure on the judges and the lawyers. And with the amount of money involved and the motivation of greed, you simply can't. There's simply no control, and that's a kind of tax, by the way. We all know in the healthcare system that doctors prescribe tests that they know are completely unnecessary just to protect themselves from malpractice. That's a kind of tax on our healthcare system. And the same thing goes on in businesses throughout the country to try to protect themselves from the trial lawyers. So I think I'll stop there and take some questions. Over here.
Sir, is there anything to be learned from Russia's ability to have gone to a flat tax?
The question is, can we learn from Russia's ability to go to a flat tax? Sadly, I don't really think so, at least not for us. I think there are some important lessons for developing countries. I think a friend of mine is involved in the recent election in Ukraine, and they're trying to do something in that country, which is kind of a basket case. I think there's a lot that other countries in similar economic circumstances can learn, but unfortunately I just don't see any reason to believe that our politicians will say, well, gee, Russia has a flat tax, why don't we have one? I just don't see that happening. As I said earlier, I think that the drive for a flat tax has kind of run out of steam because we've given it a pretty good shot on a couple of occasions. We just didn't get anywhere, and I think that it's just too big. It's just too much to do to start all over from scratch, and that's why Russia was able to do what they did. They, in essence, were starting from scratch. Although they had a tax system, it was being evaded so widely and so easily that they were getting very, very little revenue. And so, in essence, they had nothing to lose, whereas we do have a lot to lose, and in the sense that we all have investments and things that are based on the existence of the current tax system, and even if we go to a better system, some of us are going to pay a price in terms of losing. For example, one of the issues that was always a big hang-up was the mortgage interest deduction. And everybody's thinking, oh, gee, that's my biggest deduction, and I'll pay a lot more taxes if or the value of my house will drop if we take away the mortgage interest deduction, even if we get a flat rate tax in the process. And a lot of weak-kneed politicians who say they support the flat tax said, oh, we'll make an exception for you. Well, then what do you say to the people who say, well, what about my deduction for health insurance, or or my deduction for my pension plan, and the next thing you know, you're right back where you started. You either have to wipe the slate clean and go cold turkey, or you just, it's not worth doing. And that's the problem we've always run into, is that people just don't really understand that, and too many people look at their current economics or circumstances, and they don't think through that if they lost the mortgage interest deduction, they would also have a much, much lower tax rate. The total amount of taxes they would pay at the end of the day would be less than what they're paying now. But they would rather they have the security of understanding how the current system works and how it works for them, and they just don't want to change. And that's true throughout the economy as a whole. Over here.
How would you assess the economic effect of last year's tax cut program? All taken together.
the question is, what was the economic impact of the 2001 tax bill? And the answer is that it was virtually nil. I don't know any economist who thought that it was ever going to have any kind of significant economic effect whatsoever. Its main purpose, I always felt, and this is how I rationalized it, it was political. You had these huge surplus projections at that time, and unless you reduce those surpluses by giving the money back to the taxpayer, it was all going to end up getting spent. So you had the choice between reducing the surplus by having a huge number of new spending programs, or you could give the money back to the taxpayer, and that's a no-brainer. But I wish that it had been a better design package. I don't know whose fault it was that it wasn't better. I guess it dates back to the campaign, and when Mr. Bush put together the proposal that he ran on in 1999, that was developed under completely different circumstances. And I had hoped that once he got into office, he would say, well, that was, we need to rethink this and come up with something new. But instead he said, no, we're going to propose the same identical plan that I put forward 2 years earlier under completely different economic and political circumstances. And I thought that was a missed opportunity. On the other hand, who could have known that Jim Jeffords was going to switch parties and create enormous difficulties? And if we hadn't gotten something enacted very quickly, it probably would have died. And the only way you could do something quickly is by not taking the time to develop something new. You had to run, push what you already had on the table. So, with the benefit of hindsight, I think we got the best tax cut we probably could have gotten under the political circumstances of the moment. And so that's fine. I'd hope that we would be able to do better in the future, that the administration would come back with some other tax proposals. But of course, the recession and the other events, tragic events of recent months, have put that all on hold. And so I'm just grateful that we got something. I just wish we could have done better. Morton?
When I was on the White House staff, I had a fellow come to see me who said he was a Republican, and he had just graduated from Harvard in economics, and he was looking for a job in the administration. And I asked him what free market economists they had taught him at Harvard, and he sort of said, well, what do you mean? And I said, well, for example, were you taught Hayek? And he had never heard of Hayek. And I said, well, what books have you read by Milton Friedman? He says, well, I've never read a book by Friedman, but once one of my professors passed out copies of a short article Friedman had read. I've known for decades that most of the economic teaching in our colleges and universities is left-wing, and there have always been a number of bright spots, but it, by and large, has been bad. You're closer to it than I. What's your view? Is the economics that's being taught in higher education now getting better, getting worse, or is it the same?
Well, I can only compare it to really my own experience, and by and large, I would say that economics teaching in the universities is much better than it was when I was in school. I think that the effects of real-world experiences, especially the inflation of the 1970s, has really had a sobering effect. And also the nature of the discipline, I think, and the research that was done by people who were totally non-ideological, ended up supporting a lot of things that you and I believe. And then, of course, you've had the experience of the collapse of Soviet Union and just the general collapse of planning and that sort of thing, nationalization of industry, all that sort of stuff in the third world. So I think that the economists, among all social scientists, have actually gotten a little bit better over time, whereas all the others have gotten way, way worse. I mean, talk about sociology and political science. I mean, these are just terrible, and history has even gone to heck, as we know from Doris Kearns Goodwin, a formerly well-respected historian, and even Stephen Ambrose, who many people here probably like and is a very good writer, but apparently a lot of what he wrote was stuff other people wrote. So we got some problems in this area. But I think that, by and large, economists have done a better job of I'm not saying that they're ideological. I don't think that very many students. I mean, Milton Friedman has not been really a practicing economist for 20-some years. I don't remember when he retired from the University of Chicago. And a lot of others, people like Hayek and Stigler, are dead. And but they have students. People whose names you don't know, or maybe you do know. Robert Barrow at Harvard is very good. Martin Feldstein is not so bad, despite some of the problems you and I probably had with him. And by and large, it's really not as bad a situation as you might think. I think if you compared the best-selling economics textbook today with the best-selling economics textbook in the 1970s, you'd find that there was an enormous amount of improvement. I mean, you can even look at, for many years, Paul Samuelson's book was the number one seller, and some people would occasionally go through each of the different editions of his books and find all the little changes he had made, where he'd say, in an early edition, 5% a year inflation is okay, and the next time it was only 4%, and then it was only 3%. And so a lot of these things which simply came about as a result of experiences, which they just learned that things like inflation have long-run costs, and once you let the genie out of the lamp, it's very hard to put it back in. And so I think it was really not research. It wasn't the great articles and papers and books by people like Hayek and Friedman who changed people's minds. It was simply the real-world experience that they observed that caused them to change their minds and become more like what they should have been in the first place.
Would you give us your insight into the state of Virginia tax system?
I'm afraid that's a subject I know absolutely nothing about. Okay.
The alternative minimum tax, if doing your taxes once is a pain, having to do it twice is more so, and it seems to be reaching down further and further into society. I have kids who hardly make any money at all that have to worry about it. How come there's more of a outcry against it, and what do you see happening to it?
The question involves the alternative minimum tax, and for those of you who are not aware of exactly what this is, it was put in the 1980s, I believe in the 86 Tax Reform Act. The problem was, or at least the perceived problem was, that there were some people out there who had so many deductions, and they were so clever about manipulating the tax system that they had very large incomes and they paid no taxes whatsoever. And so the idea was to put in, we're going to have this alternative minimum tax, and what it is, it's like a completely separate tax system. You figure out your taxes once the normal way, and then you have to use this other system, this AMT return, where they take away a lot of your deductions, and you have a lower rate, but it's like a flat rate system, except that it's an alternate system. And you calculate your taxes both ways, and whichever one you pay more under, that's the one you got to pay. So this AMT, the problem with it is it has an exemption level of, I think, $30-some thousand, but it's never been indexed to inflation. So the consequence is, as people's incomes rise, more and more people, $30,000 today is not that big an income, and it wasn't even all that big back in 1986, but it was a lot more. And so the consequence is that people are being pushed up into the AMT. And so people with very modest incomes and relatively few deductions are still finding that they're having to pay this alternative minimum tax that was put in for the sole purpose of getting the rich to pay their taxes. And this is a very important lesson. So much of what was done is bad in our tax system was put in solely to soak the rich, and the next thing you know, the middle class are the ones who are paying it, and AMT is a classic example. Now the problem with the AMT is that the revenues from it are relatively low right now, but are projected to rise very rapidly in the future. And within a few years, there's going to be a lot of people, many more people than now, paying the AMT. And so it's one of those classic Washington problems of a problem that is not sufficiently immediate enough in terms of an outcry to force action. And so everybody in Congress knows this is a problem, and it's going to have to be fixed. But it's one that can easily be put off till tomorrow, and then tomorrow gets put off till the next day, and et cetera, because it's just not immediate enough. So it's like the problem with Social Security and so many of these other programs that we know off into the future, maybe even decades into the future, are going to be very serious problems, but you can't get anybody motivated to do anything about it, even if everybody agrees with you, because, well, we got all this other stuff we got to do, you know, we got to pass appropriations bills and stuff like that, and you just, it's just very hard to get people motivated. But one of the interesting things about the AMT is that many of the people leading the charge now about fixing this problem are in fact the people who put it in the first place. They're saying, oh, all these poor people are going to have to pay the AMT, and that's not fair. We got to fix this problem. And I said, well, you're the idiots that put this damn thing in, you know. So they always want to have it both ways, and unfortunately they get away with it. Over here.
Yes, as a younger person that can't necessarily afford an accountant, there's laws and those things. Using our law, or fear that we're screw up with the dollar. I was wondering if you could turn that into some kind of political advantage where it seems the poorer you are and the younger you are, the harder it is to jump into an economic bracket where you can afford an accountant and then start saving for the future. And so if you're too poor to afford an accountant, you're never going to be able to save all the dollars you mentioned in middle class or house or retirement.
Well, there are of course any number of, I mean, we're inundated these days with financial advice, and the only thing I would suggest is to say is if I was starting over again and I was in your circumstances or the same circumstances I was in, the one thing I would do is invest more, save more early, and try to put the money into stocks. But back when I was your age, you know, everybody put all their money in housing, and that's what I did too. Eventually it worked out for me, but I still would have been a lot better off if I just bought any damn stock, you know, in the Dow Jones Industrial Average, or just buy an index fund. You know, the compounding is so powerful, and it adds up over time. And if your income is low enough, you can take advantage of the Roth IRA, which is very, very powerful. In case people here don't know, there's two different types of IRAs. There's the one that you get a deduction for the money you put in, and then you pay taxes when you take the money out. The Roth IRA is the reverse. You get no deduction for putting the money in, but since you're probably in a very low tax bracket, the deduction wouldn't help you that much anyway. But at the back end, you take all the money out tax-free. And you can also pass that money through to your estate tax-free, which is very, very powerful. And so I would try to buy stocks that you think that you're never really ever going to want to sell. Buy S&P 500 index funds, something like that, and just hold on to it forever. And I think that's the thing to do. And you don't need an accountant to tell you to do that.
One more.
Okay.
Can you tell us about the relationship between cutting taxes and increasing government revenue? Did that happen in the Reagan administration?
The question is basically, did the Laffer curve work? Did we get more revenue from cutting tax rates? It sort of, we got back a lot of revenue. We didn't get back all of it. Lowering the top rate unquestionably increased revenue. People went out and earned taxable income that they would not have otherwise earned, and so the government got more revenue from lowering the top rate. We certainly got more government revenue from cutting the capital gains tax, and perhaps over a long enough period of time, the total size of the economy was bigger by enough to where we were probably getting as much revenue at that point in the future as we would have gotten otherwise, but not in the years in between. So it sort of depends on how you do the calculation. The guy who did most of the work on this is a guy named Larry Lindsay, who's now the president's economic advisor, and he wrote a book. I have a mental blank off the top of my head, but I think it's still in print. Lawrence Lindsay, and and he concluded, I think, that we got back like half the revenue, something like that, by trying to calculate what we would have gotten in the absence of any tax changes. So the Laffer curve works. It just doesn't work quite as simply as some people may have thought. You can't cut tax rates across the board and get back all the revenue immediately. You may get it back eventually. You may get back revenue very quickly from cutting the top rate, but not from an across-the-board rate cut. Okay?
Thank you very much. what a great exposition of interesting and educational things. Bruce, I appreciate very much your coming, and I have the honor of presenting to you, as a token of our appreciation, an Adam Smith tie.
Well, thank you. It's one that I don't have. Thank you very
Good.
much.
This is the latest model that we have. Happy for you to have it, and you certainly qualify in terms of your commitment to the free market to wear the Adam Smith tie. Wednesday, May 1st, our next Wednesday Wake Up Club breakfast, our special guest and speaker will be Ambassador Charles Lichtenstein. You all will remember that he was one of Reagan's ambassadors at the United Nations, and when the delegations from other nations, including third world nations, were giving him a lot of grief, giving the United States a lot of grief, Lichtenstein, working there with Jeane Kirkpatrick, threw a lot of cold water on their faces. In one case, his most famous comment was that as they were attacking the United States on the floor of the General Assembly, he proceeds to tell them that if they don't like the United States, they're free to leave the United States, and that he, for one, would stand on the pier and wave goodbye as they sail off into the sunset. Terrific guy, Chuck Lichtenstein. You'll enjoy him. Those of you who would like a tour of the Leadership Institute, including the famous Leonardo da Vinci notebook, nicely framed in the basement dormitory floor, Anne-Marie Mullen is your gal. She will be delighted to lead a tour. Just cluster here with her, and she'll take you on a tour. If you haven't been on a tour for a while, I encourage you to do it. Things change around here a bit, and there are new things to see. Thank you all very much.